Welcome back to Good Morning Kenya. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, I am about to have a discussion that is of interest and should be of interest to each and every one of us, and that is climate change. And joining me in studio on my right is Mr. Joseph Nganga, who is the CEO Africa Climate Summit, and we will be talking about the summit that is set to take place next month. That is the beginning of next month, from the 1st to the 8th. That will be the entire week where we will be talking about climate change. Mr. Joseph, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lillian. Good morning.
Very well, thank you. It is Vivian.
Vivian,
yes,
excuse me.
without me.
Yes.
No problem. How are you doing this morning?
Very well, thank you. And clearly still waking up.
You're still waking up. I can see you have your
I have
coffee
my wonderful Kenyan coffee. Thank you.
All right, welcome to the show. We are pleased to have you here. If we may just begin with you defining what climate change is.
Indeed. Climate change is the changing of the weather patterns of the climate and the environment driven by adjustments to the ozone layer, is caused by CO2, increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. The way we experience climate change is when weather changes, when you're used to two rainy seasons, one in April and the other in September, and suddenly you only have one, or when you get them, they're very limited, or you have long droughts. So we experience it in terms of weather changes, but climate change scientifically is a diminishing ozone layer which changes the climate.
Yeah. What other evidences show or prove that climate is truly changing at the moment?
I think here in Kenya we've experienced substantial drought, which has caused a lot of problems for farmers, for livestock, and for our nomadic communities. So we've experienced that in a huge way in terms of loss of livestock, for example. Across the continent, we are seeing a lot of cyclones. For example, Malawi has had 3 cyclones in the last 2 years, as well as Mozambique. Lots of flooding, unusual weather patterns that tell us that things are not what they used to be, is what we're experiencing. Globally, in the north in particular, a lot of heat waves. In Italy, for example, they had, and Greece, they had to evacuate people in the summer because of excessive heat, where typically they've not had air conditioning, but you're in degrees of 46 or more in terms of heat. That tells you that things have really changed, and so you're seeing evacuations from a weather perspective. In fact, the UN Secretary General called it global boiling now. It's no longer global warming. It's become quite catastrophic, yes.
We've also, I've seen, I think I saw just yesterday, India experienced some serious flooding and houses were being swept away. So there's evidence that, you know, climate is truly changing and something needs to be done.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
What are some of the causes of climate change?
I think the most obvious one is emissions. As you know, as the world has grown in terms of population, in terms of industrialization, we've had to use a lot of fossil fuels. We've had to cut trees. We've had to reduce environmental factors that would otherwise reduce the impacts of excessive CO2 in the atmosphere. That is how, that is what is causing the climate change, is excessive CO2 in the atmosphere as a function of the fossil fuels we're using for electricity, for transportation, industrialization, as well as other gases such as methane that come from, for example, when you're mining fossil fuels, you emit methane and natural gas, and that also impacts the climate.
How are we as humans, you know, contributing to this climate change that we are seeing?
So, Vivian, if I ask, how did you get here this morning?
By car.
And that car was fueled by?
Petrol.
Exactly. So in our daily lives today, as a normal way of living, we live in houses that have electricity. Kenya is unique in that our electricity is relatively clean, but globally, electricity is one of the biggest sources of emissions. Our transportation sector, whether you drive or you take an airplane, those use fossil fuels. Those cause emissions as well, and that is also impacting climate. As we go into farming, as you plow and reduce forest cover, the ability of the atmosphere to absorb CO2 is further diminished. So our way of living, our daily lives today as they are designed, are causing excessive CO2 and therefore climate change.
But what should we do? I mean, what are the alternatives? You just asked me how I got here, you know, and the car was using fuel, of course. What do I do? I mean, what are the alternatives that are there for us to save the environment that we're living in?
I think we start by being aware of it. Awareness is so crucial. For example, yes, today in Kenya there are a few electric vehicles. We need to increase the availability of these vehicles so that we reduce CO2 in emissions. And because again, Kenya has a very clean grid. We are over 90% of renewable energy on our grid. When you charge your vehicle on a clean grid, you're reducing your emissions. So one is being aware. Two is consciously choosing the right technologies for our day-to-day lives. So transportation, for example. And there is a huge opportunity from an economics as well. Today, with petrol prices where they are, if you're driving an electric vehicle, you will save a lot more money. So it's not just saving the environment, it's also economically better for individuals to make that transition. A friend was telling me last night that they got a Nissan Leaf for $1.5 million shillings, and they have only spent about 15,000 shillings up to now since the beginning of the year in terms of fuel costs. So the economics of going green in a country like Kenya, where the grid is quite clean, make a lot of sense. So we as individuals must be aware. We must start adopting technologies that are clean and better for the environment. And thirdly, I think governments have a responsibility to provide incentives to allow for this rapid adoption of cleaner technologies.
Who is not doing their job right, or what is not being done in order to make sure that we are educating the masses? Because I'm sure most of it is simply because of ignorance. People don't know if they are spoiling or polluting the environment in one way or the other. So what should be done? Who is not doing their work properly?
I think I'll start by saying what is being done, and this is in part a function of the Africa Climate Summit. His Excellency the President of Kenya, President Ruto, has gone on a global stage and really highlighted the need for urgent action at scale to address these challenges. So what is being done right is, I think Kenya is showing tremendous leadership through our president on a global stage, and that's why we've seen such enormous interest in the summit and in this new narrative. To your question, the narrative is that we're in this together. We must not point fingers. So I will not say who's not doing what or who should be doing what. What I must say is we all have a role to play. And if we each play our role, then we can address these challenges.
Yeah, and we clearly need to do something about it, because I was looking at the statistics, and the rate of warming since 1981 is at 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. And, you know, and the CO2 emissions have increased by 90%, you know. This should worry us, right? Don't you agree?
Absolutely, and clearly you've done your homework. The trend is not in our favor. And to be quite clear, where we are seeing a lot of growth in potential emissions is where countries are growing in population, growing in economy, growing in industrialization. And that's where most of the population lives. So we must consciously, and again in the context of the summit, we must consciously look to the future with a new perspective, which says we all have a role to play in addressing the climate crisis. And if we do so, we need to keep the Paris target of 1.5 degrees or lower in order to maintain our the environment as we would like it to remain. And to achieve that, of course, a lot of effort needs to go into it. But you're right, the trajectory is not encouraging.
What are the solution strategies to this?
As I mentioned earlier, I think the first one is awareness. I think the second one is adopting new technologies that allow for us to transition from what is causing this challenge, which is well understood. Science has analyzed and demonstrated that use of fossil fuels, use of industrial fuels, industrial agriculture, diminishing forest cover are all things that are causing this crisis. And so when you know what the problem is, you can also define the solutions, and the solutions are the opposite of that. So better technologies, better options for transportation, electricity, and so on, to start addressing the trajectory and hopefully change the path towards staying within 1.5 degrees.
All right, so we will be having the summit in September. What is the summit all about? Maybe for someone who's watching and they're not sure about what the summit is all about, that is the Africa Climate Summit.
Absolutely, and perhaps, Vivian, we start by describing what it is.
Yes.
So the summit is an African Union summit as mandated by the African Union in 2019. It's hosted in Kenya by His Excellency the President of Kenya, President Ruto, in his capacity as the chair of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. And so it's an AU summit hosted by Kenya and by His Excellency the President. And what the summit hopes to do is really address the climate crisis in a different perspective. Up until now, the focus has been on those who polluted must pay, those who are suffering the biggest brunt of climate change must be compensated, and those conversations are crucial and they're very important and they must continue. But even with those conversations, we are not yet changing the trajectory. And so His Excellency's vision at this summit is that we change the path to not only addressing historic challenges, but also change the conversation to start speaking to what could be if we sat around together as a global community impacted by the same crisis, and each of us brought our solution to the table. So the summit will look to change the climate narrative, to address how each of us can contribute to the solution, and do so in a way that advances our collective well-being given the crisis.
Do you have set policies that have been put in place to combat this change?
Indeed. So if you think about the global community, different countries are taking different measures to address the climate crisis. We're seeing enormous investments in renewable energy in China. The European Union is advancing significant policy mandates, including, for example, the end of internal combustion engines, so petrol and diesel-driven vehicles, by 2035. The US has deployed the Inflation Reduction Act that really spends a lot of money towards renewable energy and clean energy. But as His Excellency the President of Kenya says, if each of us air condition our little corner, but the whole building is burning, we are all going to burn. And so we need a global conversation, not just these regional ones, because the climate crisis is a global challenge.
Indeed, indeed. Kenya is hosting, right? And what does that mean for us as Kenyans to host, this African summit?
I think as an inaugural African Climate Summit, Kenyans must feel very proud. And this has been under the leadership of His Excellency the President, engaging the world on a global platform. A lot of us watched him in Paris during the summit there a couple of months ago. And that leadership on a global stage really puts Kenya in a very positive light. We all have a role to play in supporting this agenda, whether it's thinking through how we start addressing the climate crisis as individuals, to how we support the country in being well positioned as a leader in this challenge. But I think it goes a lot further than that. While this is being hosted in Kenya, it's an African initiative by the African Union. And so it's about us collectively as Africans sitting around the table and saying, we are not victims. We have solutions we bring to the table. Kenya and other countries have significant amounts of renewable energy capability and potential. The Congo Basin has a lot of forestry, rainforests that serve as the lungs of the world, absorbing a lot of CO2. In North Africa, we have a lot of solar energy potential that we can deploy. In the Congo Basin, again, we have minerals that can be used to make batteries for vehicles, for the grid, and so on. And so it's about us as Africans taking our rightful position in the climate conversation and saying we have something to offer. We want the world to engage us at an equal level, so that what we have to offer is fairly compensated, and we provide that solution to the world, and in exchange we get the finance and the technology required to turn this potential into outcomes, so that we're addressing the global crisis together.
I'd love to know, are there known climate change predictions for Africa for the future?
There are models, and the models have different perspectives. For example, in Eastern Africa, models demonstrate that we'll have a lot more rainfall, but in a lot less time. So you get flash floods as opposed to long rains. And so those kinds of models and their projections tell us how we can start preparing, how we can start planning. And as one of the 5 thematic themes of the summit is how we think about infrastructure, from roads to bridges to railway lines, in the context of the climate models and their predictions. And so, yes, depending on which region of the world, there are models that predict what you can anticipate and how you can hopefully work towards mitigating against those impacts.
Okay. If I just look at our weather and how it has been so far, you know, we're used to July being a cold season. Yes, it was cold, but there was some, you know, days when we were experiencing sunny days, you know. And right now, even in the month of August, I feel like it's wishy-washy. Like we're not sure how tomorrow is going to be, you know, in terms of weather. The day before yesterday, it was a bit sunny, and then today I woke up, it was raining. So clearly, you know, there's some changes that are not really, you know, that are happening, you know. So everyone has got an initiative to just take it upon themselves to help in this change. Maybe for someone who's watching us right now at home and they want to know the role they can play, in changing and combating this climate change. In a very small way, how do they do it?
It's actually a very good question. And again, in the context of His Excellency's vision, we're in this together. We all have a role to play, from the individual in their house all the way to national governments, regional governments, and in fact, the entire world. And so what can I do in my own house?
Yes.
Things like recycling. Don't drive if you don't have to. Take the bicycle if you can. Walk. Use less fossil fuels.
One would argue, do we have proper roads for taking bicycles? So that's a story for another day.
I do have a bicycle, and I must say it's quite the dangerous sport. I hope my insurance company is not listening. But yes, making a personal effort to use less fossil fuels. When you cook at home, if you have an option between a cleaner fuel and charcoal, let's not just think about the economics, which I appreciate are incredibly important, and we must be sensitive to the current economic situation in the country. But whenever you have options, being thoughtful about those options and using the cleaner one is crucial. I think for those of us who are parents, working with our children to educate them, because they and their grandchildren, their children and grandchildren will be even more impacted than we will be, helping them prepare for what's coming. I think those are some of the things on an individual basis we can do. The voice of the citizens of the world, and indeed Kenya or Africa, is also very strong. We need to engage our policymakers to address some of the policies that are net revenue neutral, but actually are climate friendly. I gave you an example of the electric vehicle. If we give incentives that the country imports a lot more electric vehicles into Kenya, and we encourage our policymakers to do so, not only would we help the environment, we would also help the economics of the country, because we are no longer spending what we do now, which is $600 million every month to import fossil fuels. It would also help our electricity costs, because the more you utilize the installed generation capacity of our power plants, the more you reduce the per unit costs, which has ripple effects into the economy and into each of us. So in addition to what you can do in your own house, educating yourself and engaging your policymakers to make climate-friendly policies is also not only climate-friendly, but also helps the economy of the continent.
I believe also maybe planting a tree or two.
Exactly.
Will that help?
Yeah, if you can. Of course, if you live in an apartment, you can have potted flowers. But to the extent that you can plant a tree in your rural areas, and whenever you can't, but you have something to contribute. Those of us who live in Nairobi are extremely fortunate to have Karura Forest in our neighborhood. Visit Karura Forest, contribute to tree planting, engage in terms of environmental matters. So each of us has a role to play, and you're right. Plant a tree wherever you can. I think Kenya has an enormous ambition in the tree planting area. I met the First Lady's team yesterday. They're looking to plant 500 million trees. So there are a lot of good initiatives, and we need to engage and support them.
You mentioned Karura, and I'm thinking, am I allowed to just go to Karura and plant a tree if I want to?
I don't know the modalities, but I'm sure they would be happy to engage with an individual who wants to support. And whether you plant the tree yourself or you contribute towards a tree planting effort, I have seen a lot of tree planting efforts in Karura. There's an area that's designated for Wangari Maathai, for example, where dignitaries plant trees. So I believe by engaging, you can learn what the options are and see what we can contribute. But also just visiting and spending time in nature with your children, with family, is a very good way of connecting to the environment and appreciating what we have, and therefore being part of preserving it.
Okay. Maybe if you can take us through some of the agendas of the summit that will be addressed from the 4th to the 6th.
Absolutely. So we've designed the summit based on extensive stakeholder engagement. The beauty of the climate conversation is also its challenge, is that it is so broad and it covers so many topics, and everybody is impacted by climate change. You therefore have enormous interest when you put together a summit like this. And as the analogy of the elephant and 5 or 10 blind people, each person sees the climate situation from their perspective. And so we've worked very hard to listen to the broad set of stakeholders, everybody from private sector to policymakers to NGOs to indigenous people to the youth and to civil society, so that we are designing a summit that delivers concrete outcomes in line with His Excellency's vision, but in the context of each of those stakeholders' interests. So when you look at the program, we have 5 pillars that are driving the summit. These include renewable energy and energy transition, sustainable agriculture, sustainable infrastructure, natural capital, and green minerals and manufacturing. And all those are really the potential of the continent to engage the world in terms of providing solutions. As I said, we have, for example, 60% of the arable land globally. Kenya has enormous potential for renewable energy, and so does the continent. And so we have the potential, and we've designed the summit and the agenda around those 5 pillars. But those 5 pillars will remain theoretical potential unless we have 2 underpinning themes. One is the right climate finance. And again, to His Excellency's credit, he has engaged the world in saying, we in the Global South feel that the current global financial architecture is not designed to help us unlock our potential. We need to change that, and that will be a huge part of the conversation. The second part is adaptation. As we said earlier, the climate change impacts are locked in for the next 20 years. So it's not just about reducing further emissions, it's also about preparing for what is already going to come, the floods and so on. So the adaptation theme is the second cross-cutting theme that supports the 5 pillars I just mentioned.
As we wind up, from the 1st to the 3rd of September will be the Youth Summit, which will be a precursor. If you can just take us through that, what is the role of the youth in this, and just how important is it for the involvement of the youth in this summit?
It's a very good question, and I think I have to say the youth have been incredibly engaged, led by Elizabeth and her team in preparing for this, and they've engaged youth across the continent, listening to their opinions, looking at examples of what youth are doing towards the climate agenda, and all this will be showcased during their pre-summit. We then expect them to present the outcome of their pre-summit into the main summit, so that whatever we deliberate in the main summit summit is informed in large part by their needs. I must say that with my gray hairs, I'm not going to be around entirely to experience all the challenges that are coming. The young people, their children and grandchildren will face a lot more of the challenges. And so, encouraging them to be part of the conversation, to appreciate what's coming, to understand what they can do today, but also to listen to their concerns and work with them in preparing for the impacts of climate change, but also the enormous opportunities if we use the summit and His Excellency's vision to turn the conversation around from victimhood and suffering to unlocking the opportunities in a way that drives jobs, which are very important for young people, drives economies. Then they will have benefited from the summit, and their participation will encourage them to continue working positively towards solutions.
Okay, and I'm being told I need to wrap up, but I was to ask one final question, if my directors will allow me. What next after this? Because I understand there's another conference that should be happening in Dubai. It's the, if you can just wrap up with that.
Absolutely. So the Africa Climate Summit brings Africans together to have a collective voice that we will then engage the global community at the UN General Assembly in New York, in Marrakesh during the World Bank meetings, and into COP28 in Dubai, where we say that, yes, we must continue with the Africa Group of Negotiations path towards unlocking solutions for the continent. But in addition, we must also bring the solutions from an opportunity perspective through the climate action conversation into COP28.
Okay. So the summit is happening in September from the 1st to the 8th, the entire week?
Indeed. So we are having the Africa Climate Summit and the Africa Climate Week running from the 4th to the 8th. And before that, we have the Youth Pre-Summit, also the Indigenous People Pre-Summit, the Women Pre-Summit, all happening around that week and at KICC. And we're very excited to invite Kenyans and indeed the world to this new conversation. Okay, thank you so much for engaging us on this conversation. And we will be right there. We will attend the summit so that we know exactly what will be happening over there. Thank you, Vivian. I'll look forward to seeing you there. All right, have a good day. All right, this is where we wrap up this interview on the Africa Climate Summit that should be taking place at KICC from the 4th to the 8th of September.